30 years ago, in his magnum opus, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, Rorty offered a stunning diagnosis of the ills of contemporary philosophy as the culmination of working through ideas around which the whole of modern philosophy since Descartes had been built. The therapy he proposed is even more radical. Reject those ideas root and branch and figure out how to do what we need to do with the sparer, more naturalized and historicized neo-pragmatist vocabulary generated by a picture of vocabulary use as part of the natural history of a certain kind of creature, as at once a coping strategy and an instrument of self-formation and transformation. The two master ideas of Enlightenment philosophy that Rorty blamed for setting us on an uneluctable path to the bottomless abyss that we now confront are the concepts of representation and of experience. He saw these concepts as by now so thoroughly contaminated by and infected with disastrous collateral commitments as to be forever entangled with them. He despaired of the project of producing sanitized, hygienic successors. The only safe way to treat these leper's rags, he thought, is to burn them. Now, I have by and large followed my teacher in rejecting the notion of experience as too burdened with noxious baggage, particularly what Sellers called the myth of the given, to be worth trying to recruit for serious explanatory and expressive work in philosophy. However, I broke with Rorty in trying to show why it's necessary and how it's possible to recover a notion of representation that's freed of the burdens and consequences he saw as inevitably encumbering it. In effect, where he thought that prudence requires building a fence that keeps the public out of sight of the edge of the abyss, I claimed that one much nearer would suffice to avoid catastrophe. John McDowell, in his magisterial Mind and World, while acknowledging the dangers Rorty pointed to, endorses the rehabilitation of both of Rorty's suspect Enlightenment master concepts. McDowell's principal explicit concern is precisely with the notion of experience that I join Rorty in eschewing. In general, McDowell thinks that no barrier need be erected, no radical pragmatist measures taken. He shows us how to hop sure-footedly along the very edge of the precipice with confidence and the insouciance of a mountain goat. And indeed, I don't think McDowell succumbs to the siren-like temptations of the deep. He does not, in fact, fall into the myth of the given. But I still want to say, kids, don't try this at home. This man is a professional. If you try it, it'll end in tears. Now, in this sketch, I've also followed Rorty's rhetorical example and used rather melodramatic terms: abyss, leper, catastrophe, and so on. But what exactly is the problem that leads Rorty not only to reject global semantic representationalism, but to recommend global anti-representationalism? It's perhaps less easy than it ought to be to glean a crisp answer to this question from the text of PMN. The somewhat equivocal response to this powerful book is, I think, partly to be explained by the fact that its readers could generally tell quite well what Rorty was claiming and recommending, but had a harder time discerning exactly why he did so. And if you are, as he was, urging that we must burn down the old town and strike out for the frontier, you'd better be able to be very clear about the danger or threat that calls for such a drastic response. I think Rorty's diagnosis of the ills of semantic representationalism falls under two general headings: a characterization of life-threatening symptoms, and then an etiology of them. He's much more explicit about the first part than he is about the second. The proximal difficulty is that thinking of our broadly cognitive and intentional relations with our environment, principally in terms of our representing things as being thus and so, that is, thinking of the mind as the mirror of nature, requires, he thinks, commitments to various kinds of epistemically privileged representations. Prime among these, in their 20th century analytic form, are what is given in sensory experience and cognitively transparent meanings. What's wrong with the genus of which these are both species is that the privilege in question is essentially and ultimately magical in nature. Representations of these sorts are understood as having a natural or intrinsic epistemic privilege, so that their mere occurrence entails that we know or understand something. They're self-intimating representings. Having them counts as knowing or understanding something. But there's no way to cash out this sort of intrinsic authority in terms of the practices of using expressions or interacting with each other or our world. Rorty sees the middle years of the 20th century as having unleashed a rising tide of social pragmatism about normativity, the view that all matters of authority and responsibility, entitlement and commitment, privilege, are ultimately matters of social practice. The later Wittgenstein adopts this standpoint to make fun of the idea of us having automatic, intrinsic, infallible access to what we experience and to what we mean. More pointedly, in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, Sellers mounts a broadly pragmatist critique of the idea of things known simply by being in some sensory state. And in Two Dogmas of Empiricism, Quine does the same for the idea of things known simply by our grasp of our own meanings. Rorty took it as persuasive evidence of how hard it is fully to disentangle ourselves from this particular tar baby that Sellers seemed to hold on to a version of the analyticity Quine had discredited, and Quine remained committed to the sensory given. Carnap, of course, embraced both forms of givenness. By far the best telling of this story is Mike Williams' first book, Groundless Belief. So Rorty's first claim is that we should realize that we've been driven to a philosophical impasse when we find ourselves committed to representations characterized by a sort of intrinsic epistemic privilege that's magical in virtue of its supposed intelligibility, independently of the role the representings in question play in our actual reason-giving practices. His therapeutic recommendation is that the pragmatist critique that revealed this kind of epistemic privilege as incoherent be radicalized and extended. But we still can ask, why should the recommended surgery extend to the excision of the whole notion of representation? That is, why should our theoretical response take the form of global anti-representationalism? Why not just give up the idea of representations characterized by this objectionable sort of epistemic privilege? Rorty's answer, I think, is that representational semantics has epistemological consequences. Unless some representations are intrinsically intelligible, grasped just in virtue of being there, understanding our cognitive and intentional relations to the world in representational terms will inevitably put epistemological intermediaries, a set of representations, between thinkers and what they think about. And in this way, it excavates a gulf between mind and world. Semantic representationalism, he thinks, accordingly makes us patsies for epistemological skepticism, which then calls out for foundations in privileged representations. The sensory given and cognitively transparent meanings are foundationalist regress stoppers on the side of premises and of inferences, respectively. That's why Sellers and Quine between them should be understood as mounting a comprehensive pragmatist refutation of epistemological foundationalism. Rorty concludes that if we begin, as Descartes and Kant, for instance, taught us to, with a semantic understanding of knowledge and meaning in terms of representation, we'll end up with the unpalatable alternatives of epistemological skepticism or an untenable epistemological foundationalism. That's why he sees a form of pragmatist global anti-representationalism as the preferred, indeed the only way out of the impasse. My impression is that many philosophers who are principally concerned with semantic notions of meaning and content are completely unmoved by this line of thought, because they're inclined to some such response as this. Look, I'm not at all worried by the supposed threat of epistemological skepticism. I'm perfectly prepared to take for granted the common sense and scientific picture of us as natural organisms adapting to and in constant causal commerce with a natural environment, which renders moot the extravagant suspicions of demon deceiver or brain-in-a-vat skepticism. Concern with how one might in principle respond to such traditional, ultimately Cartesian epistemological worries does not and should not exert any constraint on my choice of semantic explanatory primitives. Well, that's the end of the response. And I think there's certainly something to this response. But it's not clear that broadly epistemological issues can be so neatly severed from more narrowly semantic ones. I suspect, for instance, that the return of objectionable sensory givenness in contemporary two-dimensional semantics is not just a contingent feature of some way of working out that idea, but essential to the program itself. And McDowell argues, to my mind persuasively, in Mind and World, that subscribing to the myth of the given is an intelligible, though ultimately unsustainable, response to the entirely legitimate demand that the world we're talking and thinking about be intelligible as exercising not only causal, but also rational constraint on our talking and thinking. Apart from that, he thinks, the very idea of empirically contentful judgments is bound to go missing. I think the deep reason for the inextricable intertwining of broadly epistemological with more narrowly semantic concerns is an animating insight about which philosophy in the philosophy of mirror and nature, Rorty is not as explicit as he is about the bearing of the options of skepticism or foundationalism on semantic representationalism. But I think it's present in that book nonetheless. The forces that push representationalists towards semantic and epistemological foundationalism in the form of commitment to sensory, logical, or semantic givenness, analyticity, ultimately stem from concern with the question of what it is to understand representations as such, what it is to grasp representational content, what one must do to count thereby as taking or treating something in practice as a representation, as pointing beyond itself in this distinctive intentional way. Only the possibility of a suitable answer to that question can keep representations from having the significance of a veil interposed between representers and a represented world. Rebecca West asked rhetorically why one would want a copy of the world. Isn't one of the damn things enough, she said. The idea of epistemically privileged representations, givens, represents one, albeit flawed, answer to that question. Semantic representationalism will only be as viable as the alternative answers that it can make available.